This week on the Communicators, a discussion about the federal government's role in establishing high-speed internet in the United States. Our guest is Larry Cohen, president of the Communications Workers of America. This program was taped in December 2009.
And this week on the Communicators, Larry Cohen, who is the president of the Communication Workers of America. Also here to join in the questioning, Lynn Stanton, a senior editor with Telecommunications Reports. Mr. Cohen, if you could very briefly give us a snapshot of the Communication Workers of America.
CWA, as we call it, is 700,000 women and men, most of whom work in the communications field. It could be broadcasting, it could be journalism, it could be the largest group works on networks. We also have several 100,000 retired members who remain active in many ways. So we're in every state. We're 10,000 in Canada, including the Canadian Broadcasting Company. Active members interested in their world.
What sort of organizations or what companies do they work for? Do your members work for?
About 1,000 different companies. Largest are companies like AT&T and General Electric and Verizon and Comcast and the New York Times and many of the newspapers, all the news agencies.
So when it comes to policy matters, Mr. Cohen, what are some of the major areas of concern that you concentrate on with CWA?
Well, obviously communications policy is huge. So the future of the internet is huge for us. Right now, given what's going on, healthcare policy has become huge because no matter where our members work, the great concern about what will the future be. We obviously support healthcare reform, but the question is, what does that mean? Bargaining and organizing rights, a big problem in the United States, and great concern to our members is their ability to have a voice on the job. Those would probably be three of the global economy. I mean, we're very involved globally as well. Lots of the work our members do is affected by what's going on around the world, so we try to build alliances that are global.
Well, let's obviously focus on the communications and telecommunications policy issues. One of the big issues currently moving in this country with regard to telecommunications is broadband deployment. What is your position on the broadband plan being developed by the FCC and overall broadband deployment in the U.S.?
Well, yeah, first, we applaud the focus the FCC has on broadband deployment. I mean, that is exactly the frame we would use. In the last 25 years, we've dropped from the lead in terms of the global economy and broadband take-up and speeds to 15th now in terms of broadband penetration of the 30 OECD economies, and we're actually near the bottom in terms of speed. So we've been running a campaign called Speed Matters for the last 2 years across the country, get people aware of speed and why it matters, and obviously bring that message to the FCC and to Congress as well, that we are dropping, and we would say that communications is part of infrastructure in the same way as electricity, like a new grid, or water, even roads, obviously. And in terms of economic development in the 21st century, it's critical that we have 21st century internet, not 20th century internet.
Your Speed Matters project shows the U.S. at ranking 28th in terms of speed.
Yeah.
About 5 megabits per second average download versus 20 megabits per second in South Korea. Does that really make a difference once you get up to a certain speed? If you can view streaming video, do you really need to be able to have telepresence at home? Why does that matter?
Yeah, it makes a big difference, particularly on the economic side as well as in the residences you're talking. And also what we would stress is it's upstream and not just downstream. I mean, people want to be participants in the society. We talk about things like telemedicine and education, as well as a garage band practicing on their own. You need to be able to upstream speed matters as well as downstream. But there's lots of examples of why it matters. I mean, for a high def video connection, you need about 6 or 7 megs just for that. And again, we think of it in terms of entertainment as a major driver, but things like C-SPAN itself are not just entertainment. As we look forward to where we're headed, that's going to be the global standard. But more importantly than in the residence, it's also in the community. So if we look at a state like West Virginia, where we're very concerned about speed and broadband deployment, high-speed internet connections, it affects the entire economy of the state when there's no high-speed connections in most of the towns, for example, in West Virginia. in terms of economic development. So just as companies in the past would have looked at what are the roads through this town, now the road is the internet as well as the road that the truck arrives on.
And why is the CWA endorsing or supporting high speed?
Well, I mean, again, the biggest group of our members, it's a diversity organization, but the biggest group do work on the network itself. And so number one, it's their jobs. So we're looking at an economy now with a minimum of 10% official unemployment, and when you look at underemployment, it's 20. So the job creation for people who work on the network, number one, and number two, the job creation, the spin-offs of catching up in terms of the world economy and the economic development that goes along with it. So to the extent we're worried, which obviously we are, about job flight out of the U.S., about folks in the U.S. turning into consumers. You can't really be a consumer without working. At least most of us can't. And so it's a combination of the two. Where do our members work? Several 100,000 of them actually work on the network, and they're concerned about their futures. And also, I mean, we promote among our own members, constant training, upgrading of skills, look to the future, don't look to the technologies of the past. So, our members are really into this. So when we talk about the Speed Matters campaign, which we started in Iowa actually 2 years ago, it was our members, Iowa because of the political interest, it was our members in Iowa who sort of took it up, who met with the candidates in both parties, who talked about, libraries, schools, hospitals, clinics in Iowa, not having high-speed connections and what that means. And so to our members, it helps say that our organization is not just about, as important as it is, the standard of living, but it's also about, obviously, where will our employment come from, what are the skills you need, and how do we contribute in a meaningful way to this country. It's not just to go to work. You want to feel like your work is meaningful.
One of the ways that the FCC is looking at trying to shift some resources to deploying more broadband is by taking it away from traditional narrowband voice services that are supported by the Universal Service Fund. What do you think of that approach?
Great. I mean, in one word, great. Yes, the Universal Service Fund was focused on POTS, plain old telephone service, or simple voice. We see voice going forward as an application, a software application. And we need to move. The Universal Service Fund depends exactly, but $7–8 billion a year that could be used to stimulate, provide incentives for private sector investment in low density areas or underserved areas. I think that's exactly right. We need, and Congress needs to get involved in that as well to actually shift what it's there for. But we need about $350 billion to upgrade our internet to like the standard of Korea, which is ironic to most Americans that we're way behind Korea, let alone Australia, Japan, Sweden, increasingly, as you know, the whole list of OECD economies. Japan is actually in the forefront of this. They have 100 meg service to 90% of Japan, including rural Japan, with a huge take-up as well. But the Universal Service Fund can provide incentive, and you can match it and leverage the private sector investment. And most of that $350 billion has got to come from the private sector. But when you have $8 billion a year to leverage and to set goals, for rural, even urban America, large parts of even this city are left out. There's no high-speed internet. I think that's one of the ways we can sort of get ourselves there. Use the Universal Service Fund for new purposes.
You've mentioned some specific dollar amounts there, and the amount in the Universal Service Fund every year that could potentially be shifted is at least on the same level as that $7.2 billion that was in the Recovery Act earlier this year.
Right.
And then you mentioned the $350 billion that, as the FCC has said, is what we need to get to those really high-speed services throughout the country.
Right.
And you said leveraging, but how do you, what can you do with such a small amount of money that's really going to make a difference?
Well, first of all, so the phase one, and this is where Speed Matters originally started, we do these state maps where, we encourage people, our site is free, people can go in there and see what their speeds are. And hundreds of thousands of people have taken the speed test, and then we publish the results by state. So, people have joked, well, why do we need to spend $7 billion? You guys have already done it. Well, we've done it by people on a volunteer basis, creating maps based on going to the site. But phase one of that, of the stimulus funds directed at broadband is going to provide better maps than the maps I have in here, state by state, and that would then allow you to take the USF money and pinpoint it, just as USF funds were pinpointed, to provide services on the voice front in areas that weren't going to get them, just through normal market forces. So in a similar way, you would leverage those funds against the underserved areas, and then you would, essentially you would do some form of reverse auction kind of thing, pinpointing this is the speeds we want. I mean, a big thing that we're stressing is the speeds matter. We can't just use the word broadband. I mean, we pushed to get the FCC to raise the speed. They raised it to like 1 meg. I don't remember exactly where it sits right now, but it's around 1 meg in each direction. I mean, again, in Japan, the goal they set 5 years ago was 100 meg service across Japan. I mean, we need to aim higher. We need to set goals that keep us at pace with the rest of the world. And then I think we need to take whatever funds we have, right, whether it's the USF or stimulus money or whatever, and match it in some kind of way to get the private sector investment we need as well.
Could you see an increase in the USF?
You could do an increase in USF. I mean, USF is funded by all of us, so
right,
we
I
need
mean,
to be open
in
about
the level
that.
of.
Yeah, well, I mean, to get more funding in USF, it means essentially it's an indirect tax on people who use telecom services. So, I mean, we're hesitant in a recession to sort of tax ourselves or advocate increased taxes. But I think the first thing is to map out, where we need to go, and then sort of do some version of an auction like they do for spectrum. But this is an auction to get speed where we need it, and then match up public resources and other incentives. You could do accelerated depreciation. Again, that's really a tax expenditure, but somehow people are more comfortable with tax expenditures than budget expenditures. But you could do accelerated depreciation to get that investment out faster. We also need to do more to create demand. So parts of our proposals are to have sort of digital ambassadors in underserved areas. It could be high school kids working with other kids. It could be working with Brazil has a project called PC Conectado to get computers across Brazil. Part of the reason, so to drive up demand, you also need to work in underserved areas, to get people, to get on the internet and to be using these services. So I think it's a whole approach. It's the nonprofit sector, it's the private sector, and it's the public sector. Not only the FCC, but Congress, local government has played a key role in this.
Well, along with the broadband deployment, Mr. Cohen, the FCC is also looking at net neutrality and
right.
adding rules to net neutrality. You recently sent a letter to Julius Genachowski and the other commissioners. What was the essence of that letter? Well,
the essence of the letter is, first, that we support an open internet. It's one of the principles we've had from the beginning in Speed Matters. But at the same time, we have to look at some kind of reasonable network management. Again, it's part of the incentives with the people who are investing in building these networks. In other words, if you had total net neutrality, it would mean that there would be no prioritization or no preference for any of the data bits on the internet. You wouldn't be, voice communications needs to be preferenced in a certain way, VoIP, voice over the internet, or otherwise you're going to get, you're going to get latency issues, you're going to get drops, and it isn't going to work. Similarly with video, if we were sending this over the internet, you need to be sure that there's some priority to, keeping the bits together. So we call that, managing the services to some extent, but it should be reasonable network management. If there's discrimination based on one site versus another, absolutely, those network providers need to be targeted. So there's a little bit of nuance in that letter. We're not exactly the same as some of the netroots folks who would probably say, well, what do we need reasonable network management for? And we would be saying, again, get all parties in the room with my friend Julius Genachowski and the other commissioners and figure this out. Because if we don't figure it out, you get a freeze up in investment, and this whole problem of what kind of infrastructure we're going to have only gets worse. So yes, we believe absolutely in an open internet, no discrimination, but at the same time, reasonable network management, some managed services that a network provider can manage that's their own services, so that, again, you're providing some incentives for them to spend the billions of dollars to build out.
You just distinguished your position on this from sort of the strong net neutrality advocates who, don't want any management. Would you distinguish your position at all from those of the carriers and the broadband providers? A lot of your members work for them, obviously, but also a lot of your members work for content providers who would be more on the open internet side of the argument.
Yeah, again, we would distinguish ourselves in that, we think that the FCC does need to sort of police the open internet and make sure there's not any discrimination. There have been, very few examples, but there have been a couple. And yeah, we think there needs to be a cop there who is able to say when there's a complaint, hey, you screwed up, you're going to pay fines, there's going to be some penalty for that. So that would probably, so we're not saying just leave it up to the market. We're saying that there does need to be an open internet. And again, you got into an area that's very key to us, which is how do we promote, diversity of information? Things like C-SPAN. How do we fund and promote diversity of information so it isn't just, market forces, advertising sort of overcoming everything else. We're very worried about the concentration of content. It's another big issue to us. And so, yeah, most of those issues, virtually all of them, we would be in agreement with. It's just on the extreme, you get into a situation where if you don't have reasonable network management, you're not going to get the investment, and then we're going to have, we could have a totally open internet that's a 20th century internet, and so we got to have a balance between the two.
This is C-SPAN's Communicators program. Our guest this week, Larry Cohen, who is president of the Communication Workers of America, CWA. CWA-union.org is the email address. Lynn Stanton is a senior editor with Telecommunications Reports. TR.com is the web address. Could you tell us what Telecommunications Reports is briefly?
Well, we've been publishing since 1934, covering mainly the FCC and also Congress, the states, on telecom policy, everything that affects carriers that are now becoming broadband service providers.
And Mr. Cohen, you mentioned right before we did that little interlude that you were concerned about the concentration of power, and in fact you've already raised red flags, I guess, from your perspective on the Comcast-NBC potential merger.
Right. Yes, we're very concerned particularly about the linkage of content and network together. So again, it's not our world. We get that. So we get to be in the world we're in, and we have respect for others. But we would say the ideal world would distinguish between content and the pipe, and would not want to have a connection. So, for example, right now, there's huge differences in price points in terms of delivering content. Right now, in terms of the cable companies, unfortunately, particularly Comcast, who, we have a lot of respect for them. We have members there. But we'd be very worried about what happens to content they don't own versus content they do own. So those kind of, NBC, which again is we have thousands of members there at NBC now on the content side. Our concern there is, what happens to that content with this merger. Not so much just what happens to the jobs, although that's an issue for us, but if a higher and higher percentage of content is owned by a company that also passes 60 million homes, what's going to happen to the whole democracy issue, as we move forward here? So they're concerns we have. We're going to raise those concerns directly with GE, the parent, and with Comcast, also with the FCC, also in Congress. I think there's ways for that merger to work. I don't see the main advantage that they see in it is the link between the pipe and the content, and that's actually where we would have the greatest concern.
You were just talking about the distinction between the content and the pipe. The head of the National Cable and Telecommunications Association gave a speech recently in Washington in which he talked about First Amendment rights of the pipe owners, that in pushing the stuff over the pipe, there is a First Amendment concern there. Do you see that as a reasonable argument, or?
So I'm not familiar with that argument. Where does he take that, or he or she take it?
When the FCC is looking at imposing net neutrality, that they are impossibly going to impinge on First Amendment rights of the pipe owners, not on the content owners, or on the delivery of the cable system over the sort of connected cable architecture, but specifically over the broadband ISP in their First Amendment right to decide how to deliver that content.
Yeah, that would worry us. We would be more interested in our rights as creators or citizens to create content and to make sure we can get that content over a public internet that isn't disadvantaged. That would, to me, be. The founders of our country, when they talked about First Amendments, they meant individuals. They didn't mean corporations. I think we're running into trouble with that in many different ways recently. I won't to get us onto another subject. But we would say the First Amendment is about, let a million people create content on this internet and let them have a reasonable chance of getting it distributed, rather than a connection between the pipe owner and deciding what content comes over there. Again, I think there has to be some managed services to get them to invest. That's the system we have right now. You won't get the investment otherwise. But on the other hand, a robust public internet is really where the excitement comes in and where the innovation comes in.
Mr. Cohen, when you visit Congress, when you talk to Congress, what are the committees that you concentrate on as a CWO?
Well, Commerce that we're talking about now, Commerce has obviously all of these issues. They also have health care, the Labor Committee, the Health, Education, Labor and Pensions Committee in the Senate, and similarly in the House. I mean, it's pretty much a wide range because our members are in, different sides of things and 5 different industry groups. I mean, we're also concerned about manufacturing. That's another whole subject for another day. Hardly any of this stuff is manufactured in this country anymore that we're talking about. We think we need a better trade policy. So I mean, it's a wide range. We're concerned about services jobs being moved out of the country. It's not just
services jobs.
It's just customer service, tech support. Lots of that is no longer done here. Even though you think you're talking to somebody at, any of these companies, I hesitate to mention one without mentioning all the ones that are doing it. You're actually talking to somebody, the work's been not only contracted out, but it's in Asia instead of here. All those issues, I mean, so wide range of issues that we care about. The issues that we've been talking about here today would be way at the top, but, workers' rights is way at the top as well. Are we going to have bargaining rights in this country? I mean, we could do a similar ranking. Where do we stand in the OECD on people's rights to organize and bargain with their employers? We're near the bottom on that. Obviously, healthcare distribution, universal access to healthcare, we've dropped near the bottom on that. So, I mean, lots of concerns bring us to lots of members of Congress.
How would you grade the current Congress and the current administration with regard to your issues?
Yeah, I would say that as for the House, and I say this openly, best speaker ever. I'm a big fan of what the speaker's trying to do and all the people that work with her. I think there's, there is a genuine focus there on innovation. I mean, our belief is, we need to move forward. We need to look at what's going on around the world that we can learn from, not simply think we're going to invent it here. The Senate, I mean, truthfully, we're concerned about the rules and how they operate. And, it's a challenge to have a democracy where now we're in a situation where every single thing needs 60% of the Senate to actually show up. Not just 60% of those who are there, but 60% to show up to even get a nomination through. So I'm very concerned about gridlock among our Senate friends. What I like about the White House is, they're up working all night. I know a lot of those folks. I think they're willing to accept new ideas. I think we have to go further to creating a government in a country where we're really looking at the ideas rather than looking at winners and losers all the time. But very excited about the president and his team, and get a lot of opportunities to work with them. Look forward to most of those.
With all those issues in front of Congress, and obviously health care and energy are probably going to come before communications in the lineup.
Yep.
The National Broadband Plan is said to be non-self-executing, that they're going to present that in February. It'll have suggestions for things that should be done. Will there be any movement in Congress, any room, any impetus to move on those things?
I think there's some room on the jobs front, and so we're stressing this as infrastructure. Most of our conversation today is part of the infrastructure. It doesn't get as much attention as a bridge or even a new building. We actually think it needs more in that way. It's not as costly either. I mean, so I think there's going to be openings around jobs. Americans are concerned about unemployment, and even those of us who are working, what happens next. And we would argue a lot of what we've discussed here today needs to come into the jobs conversation. 21st century infrastructure, it's not the same as it was in previous years.
Mr. Cohen, on your website, you did a recent analysis or report comparing or talking about Google and AT&T, which
Right.
I found interesting. Could you tell our audience briefly what that is, and if they want to see it, where they can find it on the website?
Yeah, I hope I know exactly where I can find it on the website. It's probably on speedmatters.org. We have a site. That's where you can go and measure your speeds, and it should be on there. If not, I'll get it on there when I leave. So it's just www.speedmatters.org. Yeah, what we did is compare. The reason we did this, we're concerned, again, back on that net neutrality front, that in a period of high unemployment, as well as a need to get broadband deployment across the country, that we understand where the jobs are. And so if you, the examples that you're mentioning, AT&T employs about 300,000 Americans. Google employs about 15,000, yet Google has a higher market value. So the ability of a Google to impact public opinion around the world, I might add, is, you know, enormous. Their surplus value they create, the profit they create is incredible compared to the number of people who work there. And so that was sort of a caution that you picked up on, that as popular as Google is, you know, searching is, et cetera, paid search is what's providing the revenue there. So that's all of the content that journalists create, you know, is getting less and less attention and less value. And the quickest way to raise advertising money right now is paid search. We're just pointing out there that in a period where most Americans are concerned about employment, we ought to see where the jobs are. So that's also capital expenditure. I mean, a company like AT&T, and I'm not, you know, here to give commercials for them, but those companies are the leading companies in terms of capital expenditure in the U.S. So last year, I believe in the AT&T case, it was $17 billion in CapEx. I don't remember the Google number, but it's nothing like that. So we're really pointing out that while innovation is huge, while companies like Google are tremendous in terms of where our country stands in the world economy, we also have to stay focused on how do we create jobs and how do we keep up in terms of, you know, the earlier conversation, you know, speed and deployment, price as well, so that Americans get back to where we were, you know, leading in the internet economy.
Final question.
For a long time, the perception in Washington was that Google's and other Silicon Valley companies weren't paying attention to Washington. Are you finding yourself equally matched or overmatched?
Well, I think they're paying attention worldwide. My counterparts around the world will tell you they're basically in every capital, you know, pursuing their interests. Sometimes their interests, you know, we would say are the public interest, but sometimes it's just about Google and their profits. You know, that's the way the market system works.
Larry Cohen, how'd you get into this line of work?
First as a worker, and then got active in the union, and you know, I've been full-time in the union for like 30 years. So,
Larry Cohen is president of the CWA.
Yeah.
Lynn Stanton, Telecommunications Reports, senior editor. Thank you both for being on the Communicators.
Thank you. Pleasure being with you.
Tomorrow